Anyway, on to our second speaker, Gerard Batten. Gerard's been a member of UKIP since 1993, and as you've already heard, he was actually one of the party's founder members. Since 2004, he's represented London as a UKIP MEP in the European Parliament, and he was re-elected in 2009 and again in 2014. Gerard's published numerous books and pamphlets which cover a wide range of issues, from the true cost of the EU project. He was the first person to actually get in and really delve amongst the figures and find out how much this thing was actually costing the British taxpayer. He's also written booklets on the emergence of the pan-European police state, which of course is based on the EU's corpus juris, which again not a lot of people know about, but Gerard has delved into the detail of that and produced a very, very good piece of work. He's also produced papers discussing the constitutional and legal issues, of course, surrounding Britain's withdrawal, and that's where most of his most recent work has been focused. I'm pleased that he's been able to come here at last. Please give a very warm welcome, Gerard Batten.
I'll try and do without the microphone, but if you can't hear, please wave and I'll speak louder. Because what I want to do is pose you a question, and that question is, what do you want? Do you want Brexit or do you want exit? And I'll be explaining what that means as I go along. First of all, I'd like to thank Steve for doing that great description of what happened during the referendum campaign, and Steve comments afterwards, and I agreed with every word that they said. It really was a fantastic victory, and it was 25 years in the making. Now, unfortunately, I'm old enough to have voted in the 1975 referendum on should we remain members of the European Union, or the EEC, European Economic Community as it was then. And those of you who are old enough to remember, that campaign was also equally biased. Yeah. You had the BBC, I think all of the newspapers practically, as well as the political establishment arguing that we should remain. And of course it was a different world in those days. The EU then hadn't poked its nose into every area of domestic policy, and we still had a veto, or the government still had a veto on legislation that it didn't want. And of course I voted Labour for the one and only time in 1974 because Harold Wilson promised us a referendum. And he said he was going over to renegotiate our terms of membership. And of course what he came back with was a few cosmetic changes that nobody can remember. I pride myself on being able to remember two. One of them was reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, which we're still talking about 43 years later. And the other one was a commitment not to go into economic and monetary union, which we're still talking about 43 years later. And of course, he was able to persuade the British people to vote to remain, and the campaign generally was able to do that because of the idea that there was no loss of essential sovereignty. Everybody remember that phrase? And of course, 43 years on, we live in a different place. Everybody knows that we've lost sovereignty. Everybody knows that the EU controls most areas of domestic policy, and this is why we were able to win against the fearful odds that Steve described, which were lined up against us. It really was appalling when you think about it. Not only did we have most of our political establishment, certainly most of our broadcast media, the BBC, Channel 4, Sky, arguing and saying how much, or scare stories about how terrible it would be to leave. We also had the World Trade Organization telling us that the economy was going to bomb. As Steve has described, the Chancellor telling us it was all going to cost us, what was it, 4,300 a year or something. And we even had President Obama make a special trip across to threaten us in our own country. And the President of the United States doesn't do that very often. I'm trying to think of another occasion when he's done that to a country and I can't. If anybody's got the answer, we can do that later and you can tell me. Against all of those odds, we still won. And then of course you had the terrible murder of Joe Cox in the last week of the campaign, which was used in the most disgusting manner by the Remain campaign in order to try and smear the Leavers with some implication in the crime. Well, what happened? Even so, we were still able to win by almost 1.3 million votes. And as Steve has described in that very, very good exposition, how that would translate into a massive landslide victory in a general election. So my talk really tonight is about what's happening and what's not happening. And it's more about what's not happening. So what is happening? Well, I went to bed on referendum night because the establishment was telling us that we'd lost, and at 11 o'clock I was due to go off to the Guildhall at 3 in the morning, and I thought, well, I'm not going to sit up all night. I've done that too many times before. We had the establishment on the BBC telling us we'd lost. Even Nigel seemed to be thinking that we'd lost. I thought, well, I'm going to go to bed. I'm going to get a bit of sleep, get up and get a taxi at about 4 in the morning. So I overslept. Realised I'd missed the taxi, jumped out of bed, ran downstairs, turned the TV on, and we'd won. Fantastic news. Got into the cab eventually, got to the Guildhall, listened to the results coming in, and then about 7 o'clock in the morning went off to Parliament Green, where we were all gathered with Nigel for the photo call. It was a lovely summer's morning, I have to say. Everybody was in very high spirits, very happy. And of course, what happened later in the day, the Prime Minister resigned. Even though he was going to see it all out to the end, as you may remember. And of course, that was UKIP's victory. UKIP achieved that referendum by its electoral threat. That's why we got it. It wasn't to do with Tory backbenchers or petitions or campaigns or marches. When we sat down in a room in 1993 and formed this party, we knew that there was only one thing that mattered, and that's taking votes away from the other parties and to win. And of course, eventually we did win. It took a very long time, but we won in European elections because it's proportional representation, as we know, and we can win in those elections. And of course, we got them frightened in first past the post with the numbers of councillors that we were getting elected and the numbers of the increasingly better results we were getting by elections and general elections. And I came second in Romford in 2015 general election, which was a rock solid Conservative seat, and I still managed to do that with about 23% of the vote. So what happened after that? Well, the answer is nothing. Nothing has happened since. Now, Mrs May became Prime Minister, and she said that Brexit means Brexit. Well, what does that mean? There was an opinion poll very recently where it said that almost 50% of people in this country thought Mrs May didn't have a plan for Brexit. Well, I'm surprised the percentage was so low. Only for 50%. She hasn't got much of a plan, and what she's saying doesn't look like much of a plan. What is she actually proposing? Well, first of all, she hasn't triggered the fabled Article 50, which she could have done the next day on a piece of Commons headed notepaper. She doesn't plan to do that until March next year, a full 9 months after the referendum, even if she's allowed to. I'll come on to that in a minute. So she won't trigger Article 50 until next March, and then she's going to discuss for 2 years with the EU our leaving deal. Now at the end, so that won't happen until about April 2019. So in almost 3 years, what will we have had since the referendum? We will have had not a single European law repealed. We will have had almost 3 years of continued unlimited immigration. And we will have had a lot more EU laws coming through the system, which will have been imposed on us anyway in the normal course of events. So what exactly is she proposing? Not very much at all. Now in that intervening period, of course, what have the Remainers and the Remoaners done? They have regrouped, they have mobilised, and they have launched a counter-attack, and they've done it in the High Court. Now, as I said, Mrs May could have triggered Article 50 just by writing on a piece of headed paper to the European Council that she's going to trigger Article 50. And if I may, can I just quote what Article 50 actually says very briefly? Now, any member state may decide to withdraw from the Union in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. A member that decides to withdraw shall notify the European Council, that's the heads of government, of its intention. And then we will negotiate an agreement with them over the course of the next 2 years. If at the end of that 2 years there's no unanimous agreement, that there is no agreement, then they can extend the period indefinitely. And even when there is an agreement reached, the European Council will have a vote on it, and they could reject it by one vote because it has to be unanimous, and the European Parliament has a vote on it, so they could reject it. So at the end of this 2 years, in almost 3 years' time, we could find that either the Council doesn't like the agreement or the Parliament doesn't like it, rejects it, and we're back to square one. And during those negotiating periods, just let me read you this. For the purposes of paragraph 2 and 3, which I've quoted to you, the members of the European Council or the Council representing the withdrawing member state shall not participate in the discussions of the European Council or Council in decisions concerning it. So we will not even be allowed into those discussions in which the final agreement is decided upon. Article 50 is a bit like joining the EU in reverse. Countries have to negotiate their way in, we're having to negotiate our way out. And of course, as I say, we could go through this long, tortuous process and then find that it's rejected anyway. So either we have to withdraw unilaterally at the end of that 2-year negotiating period, or it's extended for another year and another 2 years or 3 years. And this is what I believe. I don't believe that Mrs May really wants to leave, and I certainly don't believe that the political establishment and probably a majority of the House of Commons and the House of Lords actually want to leave. Mrs May was a Remainer.
Yeah.
If the Remainers had won, she'd now be telling us that it was the best decision, it's in our national interest, and we have to make the best of it, and it's all going to work out wonderfully. Does anybody doubt that? Of course not. That's exactly what she'd be doing. So why should we trust her now? And on the basis of what she's done since June the 24th, then we have no reason to trust her. So the Remainers have gone off to the High Court, and they've said that the government cannot trigger Article 50 anyway without a vote of the House of Commons. And the High Court has reached an extraordinary verdict by agreeing with them and saying that there has to be a vote in the House of Commons before Article 50 can be triggered anyway. Now, every treaty that we've ever entered into, certainly in all the European Union treaties, from the Treaty of Rome from 1972 onwards, has been signed by the government under the royal prerogative. The position of treaties is that they are agreements between the sovereign, the Queen in Parliament, and another foreign state. Unless they affect domestic law, Parliament is not concerned with them, and it has no power to interfere. Now, you may remember that back in '92, Eurosceptics then took or tried to take the government to court on the basis that the Treaty of European Union was unconstitutional and shouldn't be allowed. Now, I've got it here somewhere. I'll read have I got it somewhere? Let's have a look. The court said in that judgment that they had no right to interfere. And I haven't got the quotation with me, but basically what the court said then is that treaties are purely between the monarch and another country. They have no power to intervene, and when Parliament makes the law, in order to incorporate parts of those treaties in domestic law, they have no ability to interfere in that either. Their job is to interpret law afterwards, if need be, not to actually tell Parliament what it can legislate for and what it can't. They wouldn't interfere. So now they're using the argument in reverse.
Yeah.
What they said in there, I've got their summary of their judgment here. If I just read it a bit, it says, the government accepts and indeed positively contends that if notice is given under Article 50, it will inevitably have the effect of changing domestic law. That's perfectly true, but the key word is inevitably. When they've refused to get involved in the treaty before, they said they can't because the treaty itself doesn't affect domestic law, and when it does, it's not their business either because that's Parliament's business. Now they're saying because it will affect inevitably domestic law, they can get involved, even though it hasn't yet effectively affected domestic law. So this is this is a bit of a tortuous argument, but basically they are reversing what the courts have always done in the past regarding the royal prerogative. And although you may agree with the royal prerogative or not, it doesn't matter. That's the law of the land as it stands, and that's the way it's always worked. And what is Mrs May saying that she wants to do by triggering Article 50? All she's doing is giving notice to quit to the European Union. That's all it does. No law that affects us, that's come from the European Union, will be repealed. All we're doing is telling them that we intend to withdraw, and we're going to go down this long road of negotiations under EU law. Now, inevitably, lots of laws will have to be repealed, and the European Communities Act 1972, of course, is the foundation of all this, and that will have to be repealed. On their thinking, they're going to repeal that right at the end of the process, when everything's been worked out, this fantastic deal has been arrived at, and then they'll be free to do it. Do we really think that at the end of this very long, tortuous process of 2 years, that the EU is going to give us a deal that's beneficial to us? Why would they? They don't want us to leave. They don't want to wave goodbye to the 19 billion or so every year that we are obligated to pay. They don't want us to walk away from it, because now they're terrified that lots of other countries actually might want to walk away from it. So there's no reason why they would cooperate with us. But what will happen in that 2-year period is that we will have a relentless wearing down of the resistance of the voter by horror story after horror story on the BBC and Channel 4, and the price of coffee's going up and the price of licorice all sorts will rocket. You'll have everything you can possibly think of to tell them why they were wrong, and in order to water that down. And I tell you what the deal is most likely going to look like. It will look like the deal that Switzerland and Norway's got. Now, you've probably heard of the Swiss and Norway options. Well, they have to pay the EU a large amount of money every year. They have to obey a very large percentage of laws. I can't give you an exact figure, but about 25% of EU law. And they have open borders with the EU. And Switzerland, you may remember, 2 years ago had a referendum in which the people said they didn't want to have open borders. And 2 years later, nothing's happened, because the European Union has said to Switzerland, if you actually impose this policy, then we will withdraw from the 100 or so bilateral agreements we've got with you on a range of areas, and we won't cooperate with you. So there has to be seen what will happen in Switzerland, whether that will be applied or not. Do we want to be in that position? No. I don't think so. I don't think anybody voted for that. When we voted in the referendum, it was very clear. Do we want to remain members of the European Union, or do we want to leave? There was no qualification, there were no ifs and buts, there were no conditions, and there certainly were no talks of we're voting on a second referendum on this, fabled deal that will come along at some point. But the Remainers are now trying to reverse all of this and say that it was conditional, and there now has to be, the leader of the Liberal Dems, which probably surprises nobody, has said that there needs to be a second referendum. So what should UKIP's position be? Well, we know what our opponent's position is, we know what their strategy is, because I just described it to you, and it's a very good strategy from their point of view. So what should ours be? Well, you see, now it's a problematic for us, because on the one hand the court is telling Parliament that it can interfere with what it's going to do, or what it intends to do, regarding the European Union vis-a-vis Article 50. And I'm working with my researcher at the moment on a submission to the Supreme Court, which will say that the courts cannot interfere with Parliament in this matter. And other people are doing the same thing, obviously, but I, as an interested party, as an MEP, is allowed to do that, and we're working on that text now. But I don't actually want Article 50. I certainly don't want the courts to interfere with Parliament in withdrawing from the EU, but I don't want Article 50. One is a legal argument, if you like, and the other one's political. And let me tell you what the political argument is. I wrote a book 2 years ago called The Road to Freedom, in which I anticipated what would happen and the kind of opposition that we would come up against if we won the referendum. And then I described how we could get out. Now, I've got copies of that there. I'm going to describe it to you now. I brought 6 copies with me, and I've donated them to the branch. If you'd like to buy one, the base price is £5. If you'd like to pay a bit more, it's all going into branch funds, and I will sign it for you if you like. At the back of the room, there are 50 copies of that, which is a little leaflet which describes and summarises the arguments in the book. Now, how should we leave? If Paul Nuttall wins and he makes me the Brexit spokesman, this is what I'm going to be saying. We should immediately repeal the 1972 European Union. That will immediately restore supremacy of UK law over EU law. Now, every EU directive has been transposed into an Act of Parliament, or we've allowed them to have regulations imposed, which don't even need Acts of Parliament, but it's been done over powers that have been ceded to the EU. All that would remain in place, so chaos need not ensue the next day. What we need is a government that's bold and with some guts, that then turns around and says to the EU, first of all on trade, we want to continue trading with you. We don't want the common external tariff. We want to continue on tariff-free trade. But we could talk to you for years and never agree anything. So I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to offer you tariff-free trade, or you can have World Trade Organization rules and you can impose the common external tariff on us. You sell us far more than we sell you. So this is going to damage your trade much more than ours, because our businesses and people who have to pay those tariffs at our end will decide to look elsewhere in the world for the things that they want to buy. So the decision is yours. You've got a week or a month or whatever it is. Make a decision and you can have it or you can leave it. And we have to be very firm about that, because it's them that's going to have to make the decision anyway. So let them make it. On immigration, we can say we're immediately repealing the Open Borders Directive. We are going to put controls in on immigration and border control, and we will decide who can come into our country on visa-free access, which countries need visas, and we will want to do a reciprocal arrangement with the people that live in, our people that live in Europe and your people that live here. There are about 1.3 million British people living on the continent, and there's over 3 million people that we know of, Europeans, living here. So again, it's going to be in their interest to actually reach an agreement with us very quickly. And then you've got the thousands of directives and regulations that apply as law in this country. And what I would do as our Prime Minister would then appoint a commission, parliamentary commissions, to actually look at repealing or amending those laws on an ongoing basis. But the difference between what the government and the EU is proposing and what I'm proposing is that if we repeal the Act first, it puts us in the driving seat and restores power to our hands, and we're not dependent upon the EU to actually, as I said, negotiate our way out of this mess. And it is a complete mess. And of course, like everything that the EU gets involved in, it's not meant to be unravelled. They have meant to create situations like mass uncontrolled immigration, which aren't meant to have a solution, because the only way forward is further and further into EU legislation. I've heard it likened a long time ago by our first leader, Dr. Alan Sked. He said that the EU legislative system is a bit like the teeth in the jaws of a shark. They point backwards, and once you're in the mouth, there's only one way you can go, and that's further down the gullet. But we will only get out if we take this very bold and decisive action. Now, then we come on to what's the role of UKIP. You know, you've heard it said in the media recently, well, UKIP isn't needed anymore because they've won the referendum. Nothing could be further from the truth. We need UKIP more than ever, because now we have to do what we've been doing all of these years and keep up the electoral and political pressure in order to make sure that we actually do leave. And this is why I think that we must go bold on this policy of repealing the Act, because if we don't, we are being drawn onto the enemy's territory. We're being drawn onto their killing ground, because we will be month after month, year after year of this demoralising process of where they tell us what we can't do and how terrible it's all going to be at the end if we continue. And what we could end up with, as I say, is this Swiss or Norwegian model, which we definitely don't want. So that's the reason why UKIP is more important than ever. Quite apart from the fact, you know, I'm getting towards retirement age now, and when I do retire, I don't want to vote Labour or Tory. I want to be able to go on voting UKIP. Why on earth would I trust these people that have betrayed our country for the last 40 to 50 years? No, I want somebody to vote for that I believe actually represents this country and the British people. So. Things are changing. You know, Bob Dylan got an award recently, didn't he? And you remember the Bob Dylan, times they are a-changing. Well, they are. Who would have thought, not so long ago, that we'd be in the position that we are now? UKIP struggled away, by-election after general election after local election, and then as Steve described earlier, these fantastic wins in the European Parliament where we got more and more votes and then came out top. And then, of course, we won the referendum. And I think all of us were kind of surprised that morning, especially as the night before we thought we were going to lose. And then we've had this remarkable result in America. Now, I'm not a Trump fan because I think they're both appalling, actually. I heard a commentator the other day on the news saying, well, Hillary's position was vote for me because I'm not Trump. And Trump's position was vote for me because I'm not Hillary. And more people didn't want Hillary than didn't want Trump, and he's won. And of course it was even worse in America. I don't think he had any parts of the media on his side. He was struggling against all of the media, and he still managed to win. And I have to say, because he talked up Brexit as well, a lot of it was to do with the fact that American voters were emboldened by what we did because they can see that we won and they could win. And now you're seeing similar things across Europe. It's quite possible the Geert Wilders, who I know very well, could end up with with the biggest party in Holland in their general election. And he's not far right. Don't believe the BBC. Geert Wilders is a man who is actually trying to defend his own country, his own culture. He's a Democrat. He's the biggest supporter of Israel that I've ever met. So I don't see how that can make him far right. But the BBC says he's far right. Then you've got Madame Le Pen in France, who might well be the next president of France. And of course the BBC says she's far right. Well, I've listened to her speeches in the Parliament and I very often agree with what she says, not on every aspect of policy. But she's another person that wants to defend her country and her culture and her way of life and their right to self-determination, democratic self-determination. And we could see these other dominoes falling across Europe. And what I very much hope that we're going to do in the European Parliament over the next 2 years is actually talk to these parties about how a democratic Europe of nation states can cooperate together and come up with policies on trade, on immigration, on combating the literalist and fundamentalist Islamic problem and many other things, and we can show that it's possible for our countries to agree in a friendly way with each other and still run our own affairs. So I better wrap up. What I'd say, if I give you a wartime analogy, we've just won the Battle of Britain, but D-Day is still to come. And D-Day will be when we get very close to actually getting out of the EU, and I can guarantee that the leaders of Europe will be sitting in their bunker, directing non-existent armies trying to stop us, but by that time we'll be unstoppable. We've won the battle. We now need you and every other UKIP member and even more UKIP members to go out and win the war. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard, for that. That's absolutely fantastic. I'll just say one thing just very quickly. If you do want to follow the legal arguments that are going through the courts at the moment, and I think the Supreme Court are meeting on the 7th of December to make a decision on this High Court challenge. A very good website, Lawyers for Britain, www.lawyersforbritain.org. Now, you might think the title's a bit off-putting. You think, oh my God, lawyers, it's going to be a whole load of pages and pages of legalese. It's actually a very readable and very concise summary of the legal issues involved behind this challenge. Very readable, and it's written by, I think, Martin Howe, QC, is the chairman of their group, but written very much from the point of view of Brexit and why we should leave the EU. And the legal arguments in there are very concise, they're very well written and well worth a look on the website. There's also some good stuff on there too on the EU single market, because I think one of the things about which more cobblers is talked about in the media than almost any other subject is the so-called EU single market, and very few correspondents really understand what it actually entails. There's a very good summary on Lawyers for Britain on what the EU single market actually is. It's not that it's single market, it's the internal market, and it is not about free trade, it is a customs union, and this is something the media do not tell you. They deliberately misunderstand and misrepresent it. So do have a look at that website. It is absolutely excellent, and it gives you a very good briefing on the sort of issues that are going to come up on the 7th of December. Most of the judges on the Supreme Court are creatures of the Tony Blair government, and products and matrix chambers, have a very strong EU bias, and I would not expect them to overturn the High Court judgment. If they do, I'll be absolutely amazed, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. Out of triggering Article 50. Gerard, we'd like to start on that one.
Well, I don't think that she's going to back out. She's just going to delay and delay and delay. And like I said, the day after the referendum, they weren't going to turn around and say, you've all made a big mistake and we're not going to do it. First of all, because in the Referendum Act, it said that we're going to ask the people for their decision. And in the booklet that went out, the government said that we are going to implement your decision. So they can't actually say they're not going to do it. So I think what they'll do is, as I said earlier on, they're going to try and delay, impede and delay. Yeah. So at the end of this process, when everybody's totally fed up with it, they will bring something like the Swiss or Norwegian model in as a deal, and people will say, oh well, you know, we've got to have it, and we'll end up in a position where we might as well have not bothered to leave the EU anyway. Right. So I don't think she'll actually not do it, but she'll just, that's the road I think she wants to go down.
Okay, Steve, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I would agree with that. I think that it's probably most likely that you're going to get compromise, as it were, because at the moment they're dealing very much with the levers, really. They're trying to get rid of the UKIP problem. That's really what they want to do. A lot of the messages have come out from that. Don't forget the sources of all this information, you know, from the press saying, well, what's the point of UKIP anymore? Why don't they all go home and give up? They're the same sources that were the Remain campaign. So, you know, we are still a threat to them. We're still perceived to be a threat to them, and we have to remain that way. And it's not over even if we did leave, and even if Mrs May doesn't compromise, and even if she puts her foot on the pedal and goes through, and I don't believe she is going to put her foot on the pedal at all. But even if all that happens, the problem has not disappeared, because every single general election from now onwards will be used by the Remainers, and that includes Tories, a big chunk of the parliamentary Conservative Party currently. There's no reason to think that Conservative associations, many of which are riddled with what we call wets, vote consistently to select Remain type MPs. And one example I can give you is North Dorset. Always has had an arch Europhile as its MP. I pointed out when I stood forward for selection that there was no problem about splitting the vote, that there was no problem of voting UKIP, that you would end up with a left-wing pro-EU pinker subversive, because they already had one of those as their current Tory MP. So there was no risk of that. And that's true across the country. But in addition to that, the Liberal Democrats, we can see their strategy developing already. They're going to target any constituency that voted Remain, and they're going to turn any by-election, or indeed, I believe, the general election, they will target those types of constituencies, and they will try to turn it into a mini referendum to get out the Remainers behind the Lib Dem candidate. They've got to do something, because the Lib Dem vote has almost disappeared. So that's what they're going to do, and it probably will have some impact. The Labour Party as well are riddled with Remainers. So this issue will not disappear. Just because we might leave, even if we did leave, even if it is delivered, it will not disappear. It will be a recurring issue. They will try to creep us in somehow in the future. Some of them might even blatantly say a vote for us will be a vote for MPs who will vote to get us back in.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Right, another question, quite a simple question, but I think also quite a big one too. If the High Court appeal is upheld by the Supreme Court, what happens next? Now, I think that's probably a question for Theresa May, but I wonder, maybe Gerard, if you'd like to comment on that.
Well,
With your crystal ball.
If the Supreme Court upholds the High Court's decision, then what they've done is they've precipitated a constitutional crisis, because it is an accepted convention that the courts do not interfere with Parliament. And this is not only a convention, it's enshrined in the Bill of Rights. The politicians are not supposed to interfere with the courts, and the courts are not supposed to interfere with Parliament. And they will have done that. And they will have gone against the will of the people. And then it's a question of what Theresa May in Parliament does. Because what I would do, and obviously she's not going to do what I would do, but I'd write the letter anyway and say, well, I'm not taking any notice of the court. They have no right to interfere with Parliament, and we're triggering Article 50. And what the European Union would do then, of course, say, oh, we can't accept it because we know your courts are not in agreement with it, and it'll end up in the European Court of Justice, and they'll take 7 or 8 years to decide what's going to happen. And then she could say, well, in that case, we'll just repeal the Act anyway. I mean, but that's not what she's going to do, obviously. There's going to be, if that's what they do, if that's what the Supreme Court does, there will be a constitutional crisis. And if Parliament then doesn't take control and say we're going to do it anyway, then you will have not just the courts in opposition to the people, but Parliament in opposition to the people. She may well then decide to go for a general election in order to resolve the matter. And this is precisely why UKIP then has to fight as hard as it possibly can, in as many seats as it possibly can, in order to give the voters an opportunity to vote for an exit plan. And of course, if the Remainers win a majority in Parliament, they will then say that trumps, excuse the current pun, but that will trump the referendum result. They have a fresh mandate and we don't have to leave anyway. So it really is as serious as that.
Yeah, thank you, Gerard. Steve, did you want to?
Well, in his main speech, Gerard actually more or less read out what Article 50 says, and well, I think you did actually read it out. It's not a complicated matter. You simply notify the European Commission your intention to leave. You don't set out necessarily anything else. It doesn't call for that. It simply says you notify under your constitutional rules your intention to leave. So actually, even if it is batted back to Parliament, technically they're only there to notify them of our intention to leave. Well, that's fairly obvious because there was a referendum on it. But I think absolutely right. This letter should have been written right from the start, and then you start the process. And yes, it's an up to 2-year process, but there is actually also that provision. It could go on indefinitely, theoretically, and probably the argument that it's a trap is entirely correct.
Yes, thanks, Steve. Okay, we'll move on. Question from John Baxter, and also I think one in a similar vein from Sylvia Clark. How can we convince the Tory Remainers, and I think we can probably include Theresa May as one of those, to vote for the repeal of the 1972 European Communities Act? How can we convince them? Steve, did you want to start on that one?
Well, they've already come up with this, was it the Great Reform Bill, which in a way may be a recognition of this issue, and under that they're doing it the other way around though, because what they're saying is we trigger Article 50, we do all that, and once it gets to the final stage and we've actually left, then the Great Reform Bill, assuming it had become an act by then, kicks in, and the 72 Act is repealed, and but all the ensuing legislation is encompassed into British law. But as Gerard pointed out, it's already encompassed into British law because it's already encompassed into British statutory law. So it's a rather academic issue, really. But
no, thanks, Steve. I think it's a political question, isn't it? How do we convince Remona MPs to change their mind? Very easy. You start organising in their constituencies now, and putting out leaflets saying you have a Remainer MP vote UKIP and you'll have a Leaver. And of course, if you live in a constituency where there was a majority of Leavers, as you've got in this part of the world and in lots of others, you said 400 and odd out of 200, out of 645. Was it 440?
It was 421 out of 650.
Well,
Yeah, 421 out of
You've got
650.
421 constituencies there where UKIP should now be selecting candidates, putting leaflets out and saying we are going to run against the Remainer MP. So if you want to make sure the referendum result is upheld, vote UKIP. And we need to get started now because we don't know when the election's going to be. There could be a snap election in the spring or next autumn, or it might go the full course until 2020. But we can't walk into constituencies at the beginning of the election and expect to get anywhere. Those days, when we did that, are long gone. We've now got to be actually nurturing constituencies for at least a couple of years before the election. And we should start now. And you know where to start because you've got it in black and white with the figures.
UKIP or MEPs.
Thank you. Yeah, this was an issue which was raised at the recent leadership hustings for UKIP, and I think all the candidates are aware that this really has to be a priority for UKIP to really pursue. I think what's almost a decapitation strategy against Remain MPs and target very heavily those constituencies where you have a Remain MP. And the constituency voted for Leave. We've really got to go after them and go after them hard, and I think that work needs to start now. But I think all the candidates are aware of that. That's encouraging.
The Lib Dems are more or less stated they're going to do the same, but in reverse. But the difference is we've got 420 to work on, and they've only got about 200 or so.
They are actually started on that in London, where we've got Zach Goldsmith's by-election in Richmond. So we'll have to see how they get on there. I mean, Richmond is a Remainer. It was probably the second worst constituency in London when I was campaigning in the referendum. We still had a fair amount of Leave votes in Richmond, but it's basically a kind of very posh Remainer constituency. So we'll see how Zach Goldsmith gets on, if he can retain his seat or not.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, won't it? Okay, a question from Kim Rose. Now the UK is leaving the EU, is it going to be possible to block CETA? This is the trade agreement, I think, with Canada and the EU, is that right?
That's an interesting question because we've got to vote on this in order to ratify it in the European Parliament, and my guess is it will go through. I'll be voting against it. And then, of course, as I said to you in my little talk, if we don't leave for another 2 years, we've got all the other legislation that's going to come through the sausage machine and the pipeline, and we'll have to live with that. On the day that we leave, then I would say that then the government can then say, well, we have adopted as many laws as it may be in the interim, CETA being one of them, the trade treaty, and we don't like this aspect of it, so we're going to renegotiate it. Whether they'll do that or not is another matter, but as a sovereign government they'd have the right to do that. Whether they're going to unravel it afterwards or not, I can't say, but that's the problem that we've got. We've got other things coming through, for example, like the European Investigation Order, which means that any European official in a court or who's been designated can require our police force to go and investigate one of our citizens, gather evidence against them in order to send it off to the Foreign Judicial Service. And you are allowing that to come from deeply and institutionally corrupt countries like Romania and Bulgaria. And I can tell you our police force they're not called a service force anymore, they're called a service, aren't they? Not that you can take your custom elsewhere if you don't like the service you get, but never mind. Our police officers will be required to investigate people on the basis of any European country that a member state that requires them to do it. And I'm absolutely opposed to all this justice and home affairs legislation like the European arrest warrant, because we have lost our traditional freedoms against arbitrary arrest and imprisonment under the European arrest warrant. Any one of you can be carted off on the strength of a piece of paper with accusations on it. No proof. And you've seen it happen. There have been many of these cases. And now we're going to let them tell our police officers to come in and investigate our citizens. It's crazy. But that's coming through. I'm trying to find out exactly when it's going to go onto the statute book in Parliament. And Theresa May knows all about this. She's not done anything to oppose any of this. She's quite happy for all this to continue coming down the pipeline.
Well, she was a rubbish Home Secretary
Well,
anyway.
yes,
So I'll take some questions at the end from the floor.
This is basically on the CSEP.
Yeah, okay, I'll come back to you later on that if I may. Yesterday on their early news, this is from Mike Beggs, yesterday on their early news the BBC reported after Brexit we would all have to pay £5 to go to Europe. On the later news it was not reported. Was there any basis for this story? Steve, did you hear that?
I didn't hear it. So, I think the clue is it was from the BBC.
I think what this is a proposal that countries that are not in the EU would have to pay this £5, and their details would go on a database so that the EU can check, that they're desirable people to have in the European Union or not. If we left the EU and I had to pay £5 every time I go back, I think that would be a price worth paying for not being members. Because it would cost me a lot, because I wouldn't be going every month to the European Parliament, and I might go on holiday once a year if I'm lucky, so I'm not too bothered about it myself.
Outside the European
And I guess this £5 wouldn't apply to economic migrants crossing the Mediterranean, Libya and Tunisia either. So.
bearded children.
Right, well we'll watch out for that one, see what happens. Right, on from Martin Van Tool. The Remainers have a tactic of delaying Brexit and causing obstruction to cause uncertainty in business and finance investments. How will this affect our pensions and investment funds? Gerard, have you comment on that?
Well, yes, he's quite right. The strategy is to delay and impede and cause uncertainty. Can you remember all the scare stories about how bad it was going to be if we voted to leave? And suddenly, it's not so bad, because we've got the new president of America is saying he'd be happy to negotiate a trade deal with us. Consumer spending is up, apparently. People have not lost confidence in the economy. And very interestingly, one of the things I was saying in my book was the EU has negotiated trade deals with about 50 countries roughly around the world. And what would happen to those if we left? Well, I said I'm sure that those individual countries will be happy to carry on trading with us under the same terms and conditions. And what the president of Colombia was on the TV last week being interviewed by the BBC, and he was asked this very question, and he said what I was hoping he would say, which was, well, we'd just continue. I can imagine that all it would take is our diplomats to say, can we sign one sheet of paper that says we'll continue on the same terms and conditions as now? And since the trade benefits those countries as much as it does us, why would they refuse? So I think there is a danger there that this is what they will try to cause, but it hasn't turned out to be such a big danger as they were hoping, the uncertainty factor. So I wouldn't be too pessimistic about that. I don't think it'll have such a big effect.
Okay, Steve, did you want to...
I couldn't put it any better, so...
Yeah. Okay. A question from Tony Woodcock. Could you comment on the £150,000 the oligarchs are asking to be returned? I'm not quite sure what this refers to, but does that strike any bells with you? No. Tony, would you like to elaborate on your question?
Money which UKIP was supposed to have used for
misused.
purposes. I mean, it's like pots and kettles, isn't it? The EU oligarchs misappropriate money of ours day in, day out, and then they want us to pay back 150k.
Right, I can say a little bit on it, if you want me to, because I was watching the news bulletin today, and I've long ceased to get upset about how they misrepresent news. They're saying that UKIP owes €500,000 and will have to pay back, what was it, I don't know, £197,000 or something. UKIP never spent any of this money. UKIP doesn't owe any money. This is the ADDE party, which is a pan-European political party.
Sorry, yes, you're right.
No, because this is the way it's been reported. So, and of course there's UKIP members in it. There are Italians, there are French, there's Swedish, there's Poles, there's all kinds of people from our group who are part of this party. And that is the organisation that's actually being told this. In fact, we've not been told it yet because this report has been leaked, and it won't be coming out till Monday when we all turn up in Strasbourg in the European Parliament. And what the officials of the ADD have said, there was a statement out today, is that as far as they're concerned, they haven't misused the money, they've spent it in accordance with the rules, but the EU is changing the rules and the goalposts retrospectively in order to try and penalise, our side of the argument, and that they are going to challenge this in court if that's what actually happens. And of course, I can tell you that what goes on in the European, and I only know this by rumour, of course, is the amount of fiddles and fraud that goes on in the other parties that's there, and the way that they milk funds is the Parliament constantly tightens up the rules. You hear horror stories about how money is embezzled by some of the other less scrupulous member states and their MEPs, and the Parliament constantly tightens up the rules. But of course, if you're on their side, they are not going to make an example of you. And in fact, though, having said that, there have been Tory MEPs. One of them was told to pay back €600,000 because he has been found to. This was in my first term. He'd been found to misusing money, and I wrote to the Parliament and I said, "Well, you issued this edict that he had to pay back this money. Can you tell me what happened?" And they wrote back and said, "No, because we don't discuss the business of individual MEPs." And there was another one who was, I think it was €200,000 or €300,000 that he'd actually managed to misspend, and he was told to pay it back. Another Tory. So it isn't just our MEPs that have had difficulties with this. But as I said, the statement's come out that there's been no intentional or dishonest misuse of the funds, and they're going to query this report in the courts if they're told to pay this money back.
Okay, well, I think that's probably as much as we can say at that at the moment, but obviously they're going to try and produce these stories to unsettle people, and I'm sure there'll be plenty more of it to come. Question from Dave Cox. Why are we not telling the public what would happen if we stay in the EU after the vote? Steve, would you like to make some comments on that?
Well, I think that we don't want to particularly run a negative campaign on that. I think we've already fought that battle and we won in terms of the democratic vote. I think we should actually focus our fire really on the fact that we've had the vote. People believe that some people even think, oh, we've got Brexit now. So I think we've actually really got to focus our fire on actually the politicians that are responsible for delivering it and saying that they are going to deliver it, and yet appear to be delaying. And I suspect that the closer we get to the next general election to 2020, or if there's one called earlier than that, that it will become increasingly more and more evident. I suspect there's lots and lots of members of the general public who probably think, well, they've had the vote and they will eventually get on with it. But I think that it will become an issue once we get into those elections. I think we've got to be prepared that every future election they're going to try to turn it into a referendum onto getting back in, and haven't you made a terrible mistake and don't you regret it. I think UKIP's job is increasingly important. It's going to be increasingly important, and the only language that those MPs and politicians understand on the other side of the fence was exactly what was identified in 1993, was defeat in the ballot box.
That's
In fact, could I just say quickly, add something to that? There was an interesting opinion poll quoted in the Express today, which said 71% of people now say they want to get out, and we have to do it quickly and cleanly.
That's not surprising,
And
is it?
Steve's quite right. We need
Things
to now to
improve since-
emphasise the positive messages about what life is going to be outside the EU, and not worry about. People know what it's going to be like inside. They're going to get their lives controlled by the EU, and they're going to continue with mass uncontrolled immigration. And of course, isn't it going to be wonderful if Donald Trump appoints Nigel as his emissary to the EU, and Nigel gets a peerage So it can be Lord Nigel going off to talk to the EU on behalf of Donald Trump. That'd be fantastic, wouldn't it?
Yeah, brilliant.
Some very positive outcomes there, and a great annoyance to Mr. Schulz and Mr. Juncker.
Well, that leads rather nicely on to my next question, which is from Alan Gehring, and that is, what do you think Nigel will do now? I think you partly already answered that, Gerard, but would you like to?
I don't know, because he surprises us all the time. So I think he said he wanted his life back, and he has got phenomenal energy. And I've never known anybody who can put in the hours that he puts in and the travelling that he does, and still manage to have a drink at the bar to relax in between. And I think he does deserve to get his life back, and I think he may well do something in America.
Yeah.
Whether he will, I'd imagine he's going to stay as an MEP, I'm not sure, I don't know. But I'm sure whatever he does, that he will use it to further the cause of Britain leaving the European Union and UKIP's prospects in general elections and by-elections.
You might get a job on LBC.
Well, I saw a thing, I think it was on Facebook at my wife's page, and I shared it out because I thought it was quite funny. It was a photograph that someone had obviously superimposed, and it was a picture of the White House. It was the actual presidential desk. And behind the presidential desk is a certain Mr. or maybe soon to be Lord Farage, who knows. But it was Nigel Farage sat behind the desk with a pint in one hand and a cigar in the other hand. And the caption on it, and in the picture as well, was just walked into the room was Theresa May. And the caption was that Mr. Trump is busy, but can I help you?
Have you seen the John Lewis one? That's a good one.
My husband.
Yeah, there was a very good picture of Nigel with Trump in the lift
I love that. Yeah, I love
in the
that.
Express, I think, a couple of days ago,
Yeah, I
and
love that.
there was an
Great
email
tag.
going around with a tag on it saying, "Forget the EU. This is what I call having influence."
Apparently the artist is here who put that together.
Excellent, well done, sir.
Brilliant.
Okay, last one from the box here. Right, a little bit of crystal ball gazing, if I could ask either of you here. When do you think Britain will finally get out of the EU completely? Steve, do you want to have a speculate about that?
I personally, although I'm no doubt they will try to deliver some kind of form of Brexit, as you mentioned right at the beginning, soft Brexit, hard Brexit, all these things have crept in. We've had calls for us to go back into, or no, not to go back in. They're almost saying, well, perhaps we should stay in the single market, and then they're saying, well, perhaps we should stay in a customs union, as if there's some difference between being in a customs union and being in the European Union, which is a customs union. So I don't think the issue will ever go away. But I, as to when whatever is delivered, who knows? I suspect, hopefully, before the 2020 general election, there'll be something they will have concocted, but I suspect it won't satisfy us.
Gerard?
Certainly, if I was a Prime Minister, we'd be out next week. But I'm not. Something has to be done by about 2018, because the 2019 European elections will be looming.
Yes.
And the Conservative Party and Labour Party need to know where they are 12 months before that. And I believe, so I read in the paper, you can't believe what you read in the papers, but that the Conservative Party had actually wound down their European election fund and redistributed the money. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But something has to be done at least a year before those elections start, because it takes a year to organise and raise money, at least. So my guess is that we'll either see something happening by 2018, or we're in serious trouble. So that's another year and a half, 2 years away by the time we actually see a result. But however the politicians and Mrs May try to avoid this, as the time goes on, they're going to be forced to actually do something or other. So, my preference is to leave as quickly as possible, like now. Or certainly, as I say, something needs to be worked out within the next 2 years.
Isn't there a cut-off date, the end of March,
and then the EU will bring in new legislation
Um,
saying that all other state members have to agree before we can even leave.
Well, there's the 2 years from when she kicks off, when she actually triggers Article 50. There is a 2-year negotiation period. So when that's going to be 17, 18, 19. So that would be in mid 2019 when this final deal is supposed to be presented or not. But of course, that's when the European elections are. So it has to be worked out before then. Otherwise, we'd be in complete chaos. Because would Britain rerun in MEPs or not? And you couldn't run MEPs if you were going to leave the European Union a month or 6 months afterwards, because then they'd all be surplus to requirements anyway. So something has to be worked out, I think, by 2018, and she realises that, and she's got to decide what it is she's going to do.
Okay, thank you, Gerard. Now we come to the end of the questions in the box. So thank you for those. I've seen 1 or 2 hands going up as we've been talking, and we've probably just got time for 1 or 2 questions from the floor. If you can keep them as brief as possible, please, and we'll try and get as much as we can in. Now, the gentleman there just next to Vanessa, I don't know your name, sir,
So,
but
Kim Rose.
Kim Rose. If you'd just like to stand up and say who your question is to.
Yes, my question is for Gerard on the CETA that you answered earlier on. I mean, the fact is that the Transatlantic Trade Investment Programme is now more or less dead in the water, and Donald Trump has actually said he's going to dump it. But in effect, it's too late because thousands of American companies have already opened up sister companies in Canada. So in actual fact, it's a decoy. So with that effect, we're going to end up having hormone-injected beef, chickens washed in chlorine. It's going to be corporates. It's going to lead to privatisation of our public services. Our NHS will be privatised within a few years if we don't actually block CETA. My question, I feel, is it possible for a Gina Miller type character to challenge it in the high courts of justice in Europe, and with an injunction for judicial review?
I hadn't thought about that. I suppose that's a possibility. Yeah. Unfortunately, if you're going to go to courts, it costs quite a lot of money to actually do that.
But with crowdfunding, do you feel that
is
possible?
I think that's what would be a campaign that needs to be done externally from a political party. It would carry more weight, and we certainly get. I mean, on the
is that something UKIP would take up?
No, because I think, as I said, that needs to be done externally from a political party,
Okay.
and we haven't got the time, the energy, the money, and the resources to actually do that. We've got to focus on political campaigning. But on TTIP, for example, I had over 20,000 emails just on that one subject. My assistant emailed me yesterday and said we've got 1,500 on CETA, so they're coming in a similar number. So I certainly think there will be a tremendous market for a protest movement against it. But as I say, that would be more powerful as well if it was outside of a political party, because you want people from all political parties and none to actually be able to join up to that campaign.
It'd be a cross-party protest.
Yes, I think so. Or a non-party protest in which parties could...
So in your opinion, Joe, it would be worth raising a campaign to actually, with an attempt for a judicial review?
Yes, I mean, I can't comment on the legal aspects because I don't know and I haven't had time to think about it, but it would certainly seem to me a good idea to actually look at that and explore it, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Because as I said, if this goes through, the question was earlier on this came up, if it comes through and Britain is signed up to it and we leave the EU, we're still going to be signed up to all of these things, including all the laws that have come out in the period when we were supposed to be negotiating our exit.
Okay.
Okay, any more from the audience? Marty there.
Basically, getting back to the question a moment ago when you're talking about when will Brexit actually happen, I personally believe that it will happen in March 2019, because the whole thing that the Tories have been doing at the moment, everything that's going on, even Gina Miller, it's all part of a delay to make sure that the negotiations start in March. They then last a full 2 years. It doesn't matter what the EU put on the table, what make a blind bit of difference to the Tories. They will say no, no, no. They need the 2 years. They will then hard Brexit, because they know they don't need to do a deal with them. They will then have the May the 2nd 2019 election, general election, and they'll win a landslide victory for being the party that is taking us out of the EU.
Can you make a question, Marty, please?
It's all delivered.
What's your question?
Yeah. The question is, based on what you're saying about the delay in all this and when will Brexit happen, it's obviously just this is all a delay by the Tories. I think even Gina Miller's part of it. Do you agree?
I think that's a very good analysis, yeah. I think that's quite possible.
You've probably spoken for most of the people in the room there, yeah.